Hi guys, I'm Joe with Neighbors Realty Team. This is Shawn.
Hi.
We're here for our kitchen party conversations, and today we're going to talk about closing costs.
Yes, dreaded closing costs. How
Yes.
much is it going to be? What is it going to be for my
Yeah.
purchase? What are the things I can
So,
change?
so what are the main closing costs that we need to think about, Shawn?
Well, when we're talking about closing costs, we have seller closing costs and we have buyer closing costs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's some things that are going to be common. Lawyer fees, for example, are pretty typical. Lawyers vary a fair bit in price, but they're typically in a range anywhere from like $1,200 to $2,500. It really depends on the nature of the deal itself.
Yeah.
But you're usually looking somewhere. If you plan for about $2,000, you're not going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
And then for a buyer, you're paying a 1% land transfer tax. That's something that we can't escape.
Yep.
There's
The
taxes.
New Brunswick government.
Yeah, they're going to
right.
want that. And then, of course, we also have other potential fees as well. So something like the property taxes, for example, is something that could be a seller cost. It could be a buyer cost on closing. So if a property has been assessed and the seller has already paid the property taxes for the year, we're going to prorate those costs to the date of purchase. So if you're buying on April 1st and they've already paid for the year, well, you need to pay them from April 1st onward in order to reimburse them for what they've already paid if you're the buyer.
That's what your lawyer does.
That's exactly it. That's one of their jobs on closing day. Now, what if they haven't paid yet? Well, then the seller needs to be able to pay those months in advance to the buyer, and the buyer is responsible then for remitting the whole year. So, and your lawyer is usually making sure that that's all paid up front on that closing. I'm pretty sure that's a government requirement, is that happens on closing for the whole year to make sure it gets paid. So that's something that's usually calculated much closer to the closing date by the lawyers as well. So they may only have that info for you a few days prior, because they may not get that information until a few days prior. Same with things like, let's say you have an NB Power rental water tank. It's like $14, $16 a month. Well, if you're closing on April 15th, well, you might end up with a case where, hey, you're having to reimburse the homeowner or the seller for half that month because they've already paid their bill for the month. So those little things get sorted out a little bit closer to the end there.
Also, a tank full of fuel.
Yeah, if you've got an oil system or a propane tank system, generally speaking, it's the seller's responsibility to make sure that that gets filled, but whatever the fill cost is, that invoice is handed to the buyer's lawyer to make sure that the buyer pays for that on closing day as well. And if you don't want that tank filled, we have to specify that in an agreement of purchase and sale. So the offer that we put out there, maybe you're planning to replace an oil furnace with a central heat pump because you got a great ducted system and you don't want to deal with oil. Well, we need to make sure that that's stipulated. Otherwise, you're going to end up with that bill on closing day anyways, and then deal with a full tank of oil to get rid of. So and then we also have land titles registration. So that's a service New Brunswick cost. So around 2002, they started digitizing all the paperwork with every property. So if the first time a parcel changed hands, let's say a family's been living in a home for 42 years and it's now 2025 and they're ready to sell the home and downsize to something smaller, well, they've never had to pay for land titles registration, but a buyer of that property, the first person to do the transaction since 2002, will have to pay that cost. And you're looking at about $3,200. So that's a pretty big chunk of change for a buyer to be able to pay. And that's something that, as realtors as well, we're looking at properties for you as we're in the search mode and going through the details of your favorite properties, the ones that you're really thinking of offering on. And we look for land titles registration status. And if it's registered, no cost. But if it has been registered, that's going to be something that you should expect as a closing cost. And we want to make sure that we consider that when we're offering on a property too. That's a cost that's being given to a buyer. Well, that's total cost to purchase factor. So just like needing to do a roof or maybe your buyer's agency top up, something like that, any costs that get passed on to the buyer, we want to make sure that we're trying to inform you of that as much as possible so there's no surprises on closing day.
What about HST on a home?
So HST applies to new builds and on properties that were recently used for commercial space. So if you had a business that owned a property and then they're selling it, it's kind of like that new item on a store shelf. It ends up being qualified for HST. So we got to pay 15%. When we do an offer as well for a property, we want to make sure that we include on that offer, hey, if HST is applicable, is that the responsibility of the seller to remit out of what the total dollar amount you're offering, or is it not included and it needs to be paid in addition to whatever the offer amount is?
And take this home, for example. This home is a new home built in 2022.
Yeah.
However, there's no HST because it was a residential home,
Somebody owned it and
somebody
lived in
it
Yeah.
for a couple of years, and there's no HST.
And that's great. I mean, that sounds fantastic.
Saving 15% on a,
on effectively what is a new home. I mean, maybe there's a few years of life into the home, but 3 years compared to my home, I think is 1967 or something like that. I'll take 3 years over that anytime. And this is also a finished property too.
Basically
so
a new home
all the work's been put into developing it up beyond just being sticks on dirt kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's everything to do with closing costs there, Joe.
I think so, Sean. Again, my name is Joe.
And I'm Sean.
And we are the Neighbors team with Royal LePage Atlantic. We can be reached at neighborsteam.ca. Thank you very much for watching.
Have a good one.
Have a good day.